Hello, I'm Jo Carruth from the Suffolk office of Cotswold Archeology, and I'm going to talk to you about the community excavations that we're involved in at Clare Castle in Suffolk. Clare lies in South Suffolk on the River Stour, which forms the county boundary between Essex and Suffolk. And Clare Castle is one of three early Norman Motte and Bailey castles in Suffolk, the other two being at Hawley and Eye. Prior to the Norman conquest, Clare was owned by the Saxon Lord Elfric, but his lands were awarded to Richard Fitzgilbert in 1075 for his loyalty to William the Conqueror during the rebellions. We don't know exactly when the castle was built, but Aelfric had founded a religious college in Clare in 1045, and records of the castle in 1090 record that college as having been in its grounds. So we know that the castle was built sometime between 1075 and 1090, or at least established in that time. At this point, of course, the keep would have been wooden, not the stone keep that we see today, or which is 13th century. On the right-hand side of the picture, you can see a timeline which gives you some of the key dates for Clare Castle. Richard's son Gilbert adopted the name de Clare in the 12th century, and the family held it through the 12th and 13th centuries. But in 1314, it was inherited by Elizabeth de Burgh, who was one of the richest women in England at the time. She made Clare her main residence, and as a result invested a lot in the castle. And much of what we know about the castle and its grounds date to this time and are from a number of her household records and accounts and itineraries. After her death, however, the importance of the castle declined, and by 1618 it's described as a ruin. Very little is known about the Saxon town, but Clare Castle has a relatively unusual two-bailey form, which has led to speculation that at least some of the earthworks may be earlier and relate to the Saxon occupation, and investigating this is as part of our remit of the current works. The decline of the castle, however, culminated in the construction of the Sudbury to Haverhill railway line through the Inner Bailey in the mid-19th century. And this picture is taken from the motte, and the trees that you can see are on the bank of the Inner Bailey there. And you can see the railway line ran through here, through where our excavations are, and cut through both the east and the western banks of the Inner Bailey, which is, I mean, it seems quite extraordinary today. You just can't imagine why anybody thought that might be a good place to put the railway through. And you can, and the siding, there were sidings and railway buildings in that flat area in front of the motte in that same picture. So pretty much the whole of the Inner Bailey was destroyed, was taken up by the railway line and causing untold archaeological damage. And really that sort of set the tone for how this area was considered until relatively recently, when active conservation of the motte and the keep has made it all more accessible to visitors and allowed the castle to regain its rightful significance. In 2018, Clare Castle Country Park Trust were awarded a National Heritage Lottery Fund grant in order to conserve and enhance the castle and the country park for public enjoyment and improve understanding of the castle itself. And 3 seasons of community excavations were planned as part of that programme. So the castle's been relatively investigated until quite recently. There have been a few minor investigations as a result of various bits of construction work, so that in the mid 20th century, a pipeline was put through the top of the Outer Bailey, and some observations during that identified building flint in the rubble there, and we found some similar things in the late 20th and early 21st century, monitoring the building construction of some play equipment into that part of the Outer Bailey. Other finds were the result of some railway construction in the mid-20th century for a weighbridge, and some burials were excavated out of there. And in the early 21st century, when a Millennium Beacon was being put in, the pit for that came down onto a skull here. So that was pretty much all that was known about the grounds of the castle until 2013, when everything changed, with some trial excavations carried out by Access Cambridge Archaeology under the direction of Carenza Lewis, which was part of another Heritage Lottery Fund project to do with the river, the landscape of the River Stour. Now, those evaluation excavations made some very important discoveries. They found some further burials, and they found quite a bit of medieval archaeology. And most importantly of all, they identified that despite all our fears, in fact, the archaeology under the railway line survived quite well, with even a medieval buried soil overlying the archaeology. So that gave us a lot more hope from 2013 onwards, that there really were still some important things to find out about Clare Castle from the archaeology. So the 3-year community excavations were designed to build on the information gained in 2013, and they had some key research aims, which were to investigate the evidence for the early development of the castle from the 11th century, and to have a look at the pre-castle evidence to see if we could find more evidence for the Saxon town, and finally to see if we could find evidence to enable a plan of the buildings on the 14th century itineraries to be suggested. Although there was a lot of information about the buildings, their actual locations weren't clear from those itineraries. So the first season was designed to look at the Outer Bailey, and here the 14th century itineraries suggested that it had held kennels and stables and houses for the huntsmen, as well as Lady Elizabeth's gardens, but there wasn't much location. This map that you can see here is a sort of conjectural map suggesting where these buildings might have been, but it's not based on any archaeological evidence. And really, we were hoping that we could find out a bit more information about what might have been happening in the Outer Bailey. In 2003, there was a geophysical survey of the Outer Bailey, and this provided some information and appeared to show some walls and banks and possible surfaces and ditches within that area. And prior to the start of works, we also did a topographic survey, and that identified a possible plateau here, which coincides with where there's possible structural debris identified by the geophysical survey. And we also could see how the Outer Bailey was dropping towards the east and the south, and this coincides with a possible bank, again identified on the geophysical survey. So we placed our trenches to investigate the results of the geophysical survey, and also not to not interfere too much, as these are just with the archaeology, as these are just evaluation trenches, and we wouldn't be able to fully understand the archaeology from them. So we inserted 4 trenches across the Outer Bailey. This picture that you can see on the map, the star shows where the picture's taken from. So we're looking south over the Outer Bailey, and we found archaeology within 20 centimetres of the surface. And here we're looking at an extensive area of a flint surface, with about 1 flint deep. It's possible that this or some of this reflects demolition debris across the area rather than purely a deliberate surface, but it's unclear. It's only 1 flint deep, and we did some excavation through it, but we didn't lift very much of it. And again, this is something we might go back and have a further look at in the future. But we think that at least some of this represents a deliberate physical surface, and there's some indentations and wear on the surface that might be from use or from structures on top of it. But more excitingly, east of that surface, we found the northeast corner of a building with a flint footing. And this building was a large building, extended for over 12 meters in the trench alone. and had some mortar and plaster on the inside edge. You can also see in this picture, we're looking at the northeast corner, and you can see that the corner's quite damaged and worn away. And you can also, I hope, see, if you look up the trench, you can see that the wall's got some breaks in it. And at each of these points, the wall sort of collapsed away. And we think that possibly this may have had coins, stone coins in it, and that these have been salvaged out of the building in a sort of a deliberate dismantling at the point when this went out of use. But what you can see is, you can see that it doesn't appear on the geophysical survey. So we thought it's a good training opportunity. And we brought our own geophysical team in to work with the volunteers to do a tighter survey around the area of the building itself, in the hopes that we might be able to identify the rest of it. And as it turns out, we could. And we ended up being able to identify a building that was 19 meters long by 9 meters wide, and with a possible wall coming off the south edge of it. We think, knowing that we've got this record of kennels and stables in the Outer Bailey, we think it's possible that that's what this building represents. But it could be that presence of the plaster on the inside wall might make it more likely to be a dwelling. So perhaps the houses for the huntsmen, but nevertheless a large building in this area. And we also identified ovens in here. And here we've got, we had 2 ovens, and this one identified from a large deposit of daub, with, as you can see in this bottom one, with wattle impressions in it. Seemed to have quite a flat surface, and at the time we thought that we were actually digging a collapsed superstructure into the oven itself. But in fact, when we excavated it, we realized that what we were looking at was the stoke pit for an oven. And in fact, what we must have was an extremely large oven. And the reason why the daub was flat was because it was actually had a domed superstructure on a very, very large curve. And that's why it wasn't really showing in the daub itself, in the face of the surface of the daub. And in fact, if you look at the 14th century records, you can see that there are records of over 2,000 loaves of bread being baked in the weekly accounts. So you would need a pretty large oven to do that, and we wonder whether that's in fact what this represents. And it's another thing that we're hoping to go back to in our final season, that we'll possibly try and have a look at this oven and see if we can get a bit more, see if we can actually get to the structure itself and get a little bit more information about it. And then at the south end of the Outer Bailey, we found this large ditch and bank, which fitted very nicely with the 2003 geophysics. And what we found, what we also found up against here was a lot of rubbish deposits, so midden deposits and things, as if the Outer Bailey, they might have sort of regularly cleared their rubbish out to the part of the Bailey that wasn't in use. And it's quite interesting, really, to see what appears to be quite substantial earthworks that have gone out of use, and that might feed into some of the discussions we want to have about whether or not any of these earthworks could have related to very early or even pre-castle activity. So then in 2019, we tackled the Inner Bailey. And here we were working to build on the knowledge that had been gained from the 2013 trenching. And we inserted 5 trenches designed to examine all the areas of the Inner Bailey. Our largest trench was right next to the most productive trenches from 2013. And here we found, as they had done, we found that there was an overlying medieval occupation soil, and underneath that there were surfaces and walls and demolition debris and pits and ditches. So really the whole range of archaeological activity in this area. And indeed the archaeology was so complex that we didn't actually get below the medieval layers in 2019. And this is really our #1 target for the 2021 excavations. And you can see, I think you can just about see in the section on this trench, one of the things that we found was that the ground sloped down towards the river on the south side of the site. And that's why we found that the archaeology had been preserved so well, and that the railway line had actually been built up on top of it. And so we moved the trenches on the north side of the Inner Bailey, where we found have been much more damaged. And of course, you can see the motte in the back of this picture, and you can see how, and it's from the motte down towards the river that the ground was sloping. So everything on this north side of the Inner Bailey appears to have been much more seriously truncated by railway activity. There was some archaeology surviving from medieval archaeology in the form, there's the base of an oven in this picture, and we did have a little bit, some fragments of wall remains, but really all the way along this north side of the Inner Bailey, we found it had been badly damaged. However, what we did find in every single trench were burials representing a huge cemetery. A working theory had been that the burials that had been found up until 2019 might have related to the college on the site, and that might have been monks from that late Saxon college. But it was actually only on the site for about 80 years, and there were only a few monks at any one time in there. And in fact, when we looked at the area of the cemetery that we'd found, and you can see it marked out here, it looks like we're looking at a cemetery of 500 plus burials. And we also had some women and children amongst it. So it looks much more like a communal cemetery rather than a religious one. In 2013, they had radiocarbon dated one of the burials that had been lifted as part of the railway works in the mid-20th century. And that had come out as late Saxon. So it does look that at the very least, this cemetery started in the late Saxon period. What we don't know is how long it went on for. And so, of course, having found this huge cemetery, we've raised a whole load more questions about what it represents. So we need to know, how long was it in use for? Does it only predate the castle, or did it carry on in use once they built the castle? Does it contain some of the castle's early occupants? And why, is it significant as to why the castle was placed here? Was it deliberately placed on top of the former cemetery, or around the former cemetery? So lots of questions that relate to the Saxon occupation and the early castle that the cemeteries raise. It's always the way with archaeology. You answer one lot of questions and you raise a whole load others, but all very sort of exciting stuff for us to consider as we go into this final season of work. The volunteers have obviously been closely involved in the post-excavation work. While we were on site, we did the finds washing actually sort of beside the excavations, and this proved a really big draw to the visitors who love to come and see the people working on the finds and seeing the finds being identified as they came out of the ground. And then when excavations finished, a number of the volunteers came back to our offices in Needham Market and carried on with doing finds quantification and some of the identification in those offices. And we fully intend to keep the volunteers involved in the whole of the post-excavation process as we produce the report, and I hope that they'll contribute a very large part towards that. And just to finish with, I thought I'd show you some of the finds that we've got. They're predominantly 12th to 14th century, consistent with the heyday of the castle, and include some building rubble. And most significant amongst the medieval finds were these enigmatic objects, which we had a lot of guesses on site about what they might have been. But in fact, it turns out that they're specialized military arrowheads dating to the 14th century. So the absolutely perfect find for a castle. But we did find some evidence of the earlier medieval and the late Saxon occupation. So we've got some late Saxon pottery from St Neots Ware, some Thetford ware, this lovely piece of Middle Saxon vessel glass, and a 7th century bone pin. And we've also had this very rare late Saxon coin of Kernwolf, 796 to 805, from the Canterbury mint of Ethelmod. So that's another a really good piece of evidence for the Saxon occupation on the site. And then two other rather special finds: a Neolithic arrowhead indicating what was going on the site before, long before any of the archaeology that we're dealing with, and this halfpenny of William I. So something that dates exactly to the point when the castle was being constructed. Well, there's few things in life more fun than the community dig, and we've really missed not being able to get out there over the last year, but we've got some great plans for 2021. I mean, as well as the excitement of, I mean, when else do you actually get to dig in a castle? But it's the camaraderie and all the unexpected bonuses of community archaeology, the open days and the displays and school visits. And in Clare, the contribution from the local art society who came out and painted us. And what better memento could you have for your excavation than a painting like this? And of course, none of this could happen without the funding of the National Lottery Heritage Fund and the support of the Clare Castle Country Park trustees. And of course, the professional archaeologists who supervised the over 200 volunteers that we've had over the two seasons, and who've contributed nearly 600 working days so far, and over 1,000 visitors throughout the works. So that's where we are at the moment. We've got one more season of digging to come, and hopefully we'll be able to update you with some interpretation in the years to come.